mi noble patria no dejará de luchar y no se rendirá jamás.
Together with you and together with them, those who were that day so cruelly murdered will forever remain our hearts, and the imperishable homage and gratitude of a heroic people that there in my noble homeland will never stop fighting and will never surrender.
Gracias, señor primer ministro Owen Arthur.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister Owen Arthur.
Gracias, hermanos de Barbados.
Thank you, brothers and sisters from Barbados.
That was the scene here on the afternoon of Saturday, August the 1st, 1998, as Cuban President Fidel Castro, Barbadian Prime Minister Owen Arthur, and representatives of Guyana and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea joined an assembled company for the dedication of this, the Cubana Memorial. Welcome to Monuments. I'm Rashid Best. Thanks for joining us. Now, why was the monument erected? How did we reach this point? For a better understanding of this, we shall take you back to a piece of our past, the Cubana Memorial, produced and presented by Sherwood McCaskey in 2009.
Barbados, October 6, 1976. It is just 1 month short of 10 years into the life of this independent nation. It was a day that held great promise for the island. It had recently completed a political campaign, sworn in its second Prime Minister and a new cabinet, and was eagerly looking forward to what is one of the major highlights in the life of any new government, the official opening of Parliament. Meanwhile, in Bridgetown, some early morning shoppers are busy engaging in last-minute shopping for that occasion. 11:05 a.m. Piarco International Airport, Trinidad. Cubana Flight 455, the DC Douglas aircraft which arrived a short while ago from Guyana, is once again airborne. Its next stop, Sewell International Airport, Barbados. Eventually, it enters Barbados' airspace and is safely guided to land. It did so at exactly 12:25 p.m. A few passengers disembark and the necessary routine checks are done.
Ricky Clark, a local employee of another airline, had been a passenger on that flight when it arrived in Barbados. We came up from Guyana through Trinidad to Barbados on a very smooth ride, he said. The weather was good, and the people on board were quite friendly. They were mostly young people, and we engaged in friendly chats all the way on the flight.
It is just after 1 p.m. The plane is given clearance to taxi the runway in preparation for taking off to Kingston, Jamaica, then on to its final destination, Havana, Cuba.
Cubana 455, Roger, clear to start, temperature 30. Okay,
We know that on board were 57 Cuban nationals, 24 of whom were athletes on Cuba's gold medal fencing team. We know that there were 11 Guyanese nationals, 9 of whom were students who had been awarded government scholarships and who were traveling to Havana to pursue studies in medicine. We know that there were 5 citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but what we did not know was that the tentacles of international terrorism had reached our shores. At approximately 8 minutes into the flight and at an altitude of 1,800 feet, a bomb exploded on board the plane, starting a fire. The passengers then lived the most horrifying 10 minutes of their lives as the plane turned into a scorching coffin. Captain Wilfredo Perez radio to the control tower. The cockpit voice recorder captured the last terrifying moments of Cubana Flight 455 at 1:24 p.m.
Okay,
The captain tried returning the plane to Sewell, but its passengers and crew were already doomed.
Roger. Cierre la puerta, cierre la puerta. The time is 1727. Cubana 455, yeah, full emergency, west, on standby.
As the plane approached the shores, it was rapidly losing altitude and control. Rather than crashing into the Paradise Beach and killing those on the ground, the pilot courageously banked the plane towards the water back out to sea, where it crashed in a ball of fire.
Pégate abajo, Freddy, pégate abajo. The time is 1. Cubana, Secretary USA 50, ¿le podemos ayudar en algo?
At that time, it was the first mid-air bombing of a civilian airliner in the Western Hemisphere.
Shortly after the crash, a flotilla of small boats led by Coast Guard launches set out in search of survivors. But all they found was a spreading patch of oil, some floating debris, and the occasional badly mutilated body which they took ashore at the Harbor Police Pier in Bridgetown. Officials investigating the crash said they suspected that the aircraft might have been sabotaged. Their suspicion tied in with an anonymous phone call to a Miami newspaper that a bomb was put on board the plane by Cuban exiles. The sabotage theory was further supported by reports of an in-flight explosion. The plane was on its way from Guyana to Cuba via Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica. Shortly after takeoff from Barbados, the captain radioed that he was in difficulty. According to the Sewell Control Tower, as it was then called, he was apparently trying to return to Barbados when the aircraft plunged into 900 feet of water 3.5 miles off the coast of the island. It was almost 3 hours after the crash when the first badly mutilated bodies were brought ashore. The plane was carrying 62 Cubans, of whom 23 were crew members, 11 Guyanese, and 5 North Koreans. The victims included the Cuban fencing team, which was returning home from the Caribbean Youth Championships in Caracas, where it won all 8 gold medals.
It is the afternoon of Saturday, August the 1st, 1998.
We dedicate this monument to those who lost their lives on the sea, our shores.
Gracias, hermanos de Barbados.
Thank you, brothers and sisters from Barbados.
Gracias, hermanos antillanos.
Thank you, Antillean brothers and sisters.
Gracias, compatriotas del mundo.
Thank you, brothers and sisters of the world.
The Caribbean Sea has claimed the mortal remains of most of the passengers of Flight 455. They are gone, but not forgotten. Today, we honor and remember them all. This monument will be a lasting reminder, not of cowardly acts of terrorism or mutilated bodies, but of bonds forged among 4 nations. It will also be a beacon of bright hope for the future.
The monument was designed by Virgil Bruhagen, the son of talented sculptor Carl Bruhagen.
This monument continues to serve as a reminder of the tragic events which occurred on October the 6th, 1976, and as a rallying call for the people of the Caribbean to speak out against terrorism. On October the 6th, 2023, the region observed the first CARICOM Cuba Day against terrorism, which was declared during the 8th CARICOM Cuba Summit hosted in Barbados in December of 2022. Cuban Ambassador Her Excellency Yanet Stable Cardenas delivered remarks during the remembrance event this year.
In an emotional speech of October 15 of 1976 at the memorial service of the victims of the Cubana Airlines Flight Terrorist Act, Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz expressed, unquote, "Our athletes' sacrifice in the flower of their life and intelligence will be eternal champions of our hearts. Their gold medals will not lie on the ocean floor, but will rise like overflowing suns and symbols of the Cuban firmament. Our crew members, our heroic Heroic aviation workers and all our selfless competitors sacrificed under cowardly circumstances that day will live eternally in the memory, the affection, and the admiration of the people. To our Guyanese and Korean brothers, immolated that day goes our most fervent memory at this time also. They remind us that imperialism's crime have no borders, that we all belong to the same human family, and that our struggle is universal. Unsplained acquittals and unfulfilled sentences left the perpetrators of this abominable act of terrorism unpunished. Unfortunately, the hate, bigotry, and zealotry that fueled that act is still rampant within the same erasers, and only some of the names and locations have changed, while the essence has not. In the last 3 years, the Cuban embassies in Washington, D.C. and France has been victim of two terrorist attacks for which justice has not yet been done. The threats to the Cuban Revolution and the acts of the aggression under the blockade and the inclusion of Cuba in the list of alleged country sponsors of terrorism are still in place without valid arguments and without reason that support such genocidal acts against a people that defends its unity, independence, fight for their dreams of justice for Cuba and for the world. Today, we also commemorate the first anniversary of the CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, declared during the 8th CARICOM Cuba Summit held in Barbados in December of 2022. This represents the reason and the voice of condemnation of terrorism in any of its manifestations, to never forget the victims of these acts, and to maintain the commitment of Caribbean people to peace. At the inauguration of this monument, this same day, but in 1998, Fidel declared Cuban gratitude to Barbados with the following words, and I quote, "Many monuments have been erected in memory of martyrs of noble causes. This one that we see here today is one more, but Cuba will never forget it. Today, close to you and close to the memory of those who were so cruelly killed that day, our hearts will remain forever in perennial homage and with the gratitude of a courageous people that dare for a way in my noble motherland will not stop its struggles and will never surrender. Eternal glory for them." Thank you so much.
Barbados's ambassador to CARICOM, David Commichong, addressed the assembled company during this event. He advocated for Cuba's inclusion in the world trading system and for fairer treatment of this small island developing state by the developed nations of the world.
Each year we come to this ceremony with feelings and emotions of sadness, solemnity, and anger. Anger at the tragic and senseless loss of life, but also anger at the fact that the two masterminds of the bombing of the Cubana aircraft, Luis Posada Corrales and Orlando Bosch, went to their graves without ever having been held accountable and punished for the horrendous and mind-numbing pain and injury that they inflicted on so many Cuban, Guyanese, and North Korean families, and on the nations and people of Cuba, Guyana, North Korea, and indeed Barbados. But this year we come with yet another emotion added into that complex of sadness, solemnity, and anger. We come with feelings of pride. Pride that on the 6th of December 2022, the heads of government of our Caribbean community and Cuba exhibited an exemplary sense of responsibility and further dignified the 6th of October by designating it CARICOM Cuba Day against terrorism. When Barbados piloted the resolution at the 8th CARICOM Cuba Summit in December of last year to designate CARICOM Cuba Day against terrorism, we did so with the understanding that the Cubana terrorist tragedy of 1976 was the first act of terrorism of such a magnitude involving a civilian airliner, and that it took place a full 25 years before the infamous 9/11 event, and is, in a very real sense, the poster child event of international terrorism. A CARICOM Cuba Day against terrorism is therefore a day on which the Republic of Cuba, all 15 full CARICOM member states, and all 5 associate CARICOM member states are expected to engage in activities to highlight the evils of terrorism, to evince our collective resolve to condemn and combat all forms of terrorism, and to demonstrate our determination to preserve our Caribbean as a zone of peace. Indeed, if there is one group of people on the face of this earth who should know something about terrorism and be qualified to speak to the world about terrorism, it is the Caribbean people. And I say so because virtually our entire history in the Caribbean has been all about having terrorism inflicted upon us by powerful, marauding European nations and entities, and having to resist and transcend such terrorism. Our Caribbean region was founded in the most extreme forms of violence, warfare, genocide, criminality, and terrorism. From Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the whole process of the extermination, the genocide of the indigenous people that he put in motion, to the centuries of enslavement of our African ancestors. It was terrorism. And I always remind people that the concept of the concentration camp wasn't born in 1930s Nazi Germany. In fact, if you want to find the very first concentration camps, you have to look to 17th and 18th century Barbados and Jamaica and Antigua, Guyana, Cuba, Haiti. Those were the first concentration camps. So let us be clear. This issue of terrorism is an issue that we Caribbean people know only too well. And if our history is properly interpreted, it is clear that it has been a history of resisting, overcoming, and transcending terrorism. But of course, if there is one Caribbean nation that has been the foremost target of terrorism, inclusive of state-sponsored terrorism, both in the distant past and in the here and now, it is the Republic of Cuba. Ever since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution on the 1st of January 1959, the nation and people of Cuba have been victims of the most horrendous acts of terrorism. a short list of some of the most notorious examples of terrorism inflicted on the Cuban people would be as follows, and I just give a few. The blowing up of the La Cubre boat in Havana Harbor in 1960, killing 70 people. The fomenting of internal subversion within Cuba. The organizing and training of mercenaries to attack Cuba, culminating in the Bay of Pigs invasion of 17th April 1961, causing the deaths of 157 Cubans and wounding hundreds. The deliberate introduction into Cuba in 1981 of an epidemic of hemorrhagic dengue fever. The arson at the Levantam Daycare Center in Havana in 1980 with 570 children inside. The blowing up of hotels in Cuba in 1998 in a campaign orchestrated by the said Luis Posada Corriles, who masterminded the bombing of the Cubana aircraft. And I can go on and on with examples of this continuous assault on the people and nation of Cuba. Now, the list of terrorist acts that I've just outlined is a list of acts of physical destruction, blowing up planes, blowing up hotels. But there's another type of imposition on the nation and people of Cuba that, in light of the tremendous damage and injury that it has done to Cuban lives, could be considered to be an act of terrorism. Of course, I refer to the imposition since 1962 by the government of the United States of America of a devastating economic, trade, and financial blockade on Cuba, an illegal blockade that has existed for some 63 years now. And to add insult to injury, on the 11th of January of 2021, in the last and dying days of the Trump presidency, Trump and his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, cynically, perversely, and vindictively placed Cuba on the U.S. State Department's unilateral list of countries that sponsor terrorism. Now, as we all know, far from being a perpetrator or sponsor of terrorism, Cuba has, in fact, been the victim of no less than 713 acts of terrorism, the vast majority of which have been organized, financed, and executed by persons or organizations based in the territory of the United States of America. The Cuban government has calculated that the acts of terrorism against Cuba have killed some 3,478 persons and have maimed 2,099 Cuban citizens. In addition, damages to life and property have been calculated to reach the total of 181 billion US dollars. That is the country that they put on a list of state sponsors of terrorism. As part of its constitution, Cuba has ratified its condemnation and rejection of terrorism in all its forms. And indeed, Cuba has maintained a manifestly clear and transparent position in the fight against terrorism. But as Mr. Trump and Mr. Pompeo were only too well aware, the negative consequences derived from inclusion in this State Department list are numerous, including restrictions to Cuba's exports, diminished commercial benefits, obstacles to obtaining credit from international financial institutions, and the list goes on and on. Furthermore, the placing of Cuba on that list reinforces the effects of the illegal U.S. blockade by increasing difficulties for Cuba to engage in international trade, to carry out financial operations, and to acquire simple, basic staples for its people. This terrible and undeserved state of affairs prompted Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley to make the following statement about Cuba at the recently concluded United Nations General Assembly. And I'm going to quote the words of Prime Minister Motley. This is what she said: that Cuba can help so many in this world and yet be the continued victim of a blockade of over 60 years. But worse than that, a designation as a state sponsor of terrorism is wrong, wrong, wrong. And you know when a Bajan repeats a word 3 times, they really mean it. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We left Cuba last week, and what the people of Cuba are being asked to face on a daily basis because of a designation by a dying presidency is wrong. And the voices of the global community, many of whom have been beneficiaries of Cuban assistance, need to stand united. The artificial division of who is right and who is wrong, and who is good and who is bad in the eyes of those who are powerful cannot continue to be the way in which this world functions. End of quote. That's my Prime Minister. I therefore wish to conclude my address today by demanding, on behalf of the government and people of Barbados, and indeed on behalf of the entire Caribbean community, that the government of the United States of America terminate its illegal blockade of Cuba and remove Cuba from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism.
We hope that this program has served as a reminder of the importance of peace, unity, and solidarity among nations. As we remember the past, let it be a reminder of our shared humanity. Let us continue to honor the memory of those who were lost and support one another. This has been Monuments. I'm Rashid Best.